Hi, I'm Suzanne Goldberg. I'm Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia, and we are so glad to have you all here for this Awakening Our Democracy conversation on food access, security, and justice. The Office of University Life focuses on the university community as a whole. So when you think about it, Columbia is the size of a small city, right? We are more than 50,000 people affiliated, and that prompts a question for all of us. What does it mean to be part of a university community? So the Office of University Life focuses on this question in three ways. First, we think about student life issues across the various schools. Second, we think about intellectual life at the university level. What kinds of conversations are we having across our various schools? And third, we think about community citizenship in particular. The Awakening Our Democracy series that we're about to have the next in our series of conversations today brings together all three of these focuses with a particular attention to race, ethnicity, disparities, and justice, and other pressing issues of the day within our university community and beyond. And we're really so appreciative to have all of our panelists here. I want to invite those of you who are in the room to look at your programs, and those watching on the video to check out the Office of University Life website to see the many groups that are co-sponsoring our gathering this evening, really from all across the university. Before introducing our panelists, I want to provide you with quick food for thought in the ways that I think universities do this best, which is the coming together of ideas and questions that we all might think about. So many of you and many others submitted questions to invite our panelists to think about today. And when I'm sharing a few of these with you, I'd ask you also to think about what you might want to ask during our Q&A portion. So here are a few. First, how can we facilitate collaboration between lawmakers, educators, activists, farmers, and medical professionals and healthcare professionals to address food inequities? Second, what can schools do to reduce food disparities? Third, what role does gentrification play in food access? Fourth, what can architects, urban designers, and urban planners do to improve food access and security? This is probably a good moment for me to let you know that there are people in this room from virtually every school at Columbia, both at the Medical Center campus and at the Morningside campus. Next, how do food security issues and policies affect women and men differently? And finally, how do food deserts impact national obesity? There are many more questions, and I encourage you to find them by looking at the Office of University Life website, universitylife.columbia.edu. Just click on the Ideas in Action page. Also, importantly, on Ideas in Action, you're going to find recommended readings and a playlist from our various speakers, so check that out. And now let me introduce the panel so we can get started. To my left, Simran Sethi, our moderator, is a former environmental correspondent for NBC News and author of the recently released Bread, Wine, Chocolate, three of my favorites, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love on Food Systems in Peril and Achieving Food Security. In addition to food education, her work focuses on sustainability and social change. Next to Simran is Rafael Aponte. Rafael is the founder of Rocky Acres Community Farm in upstate New York, where in addition to raising goats and chickens and growing vegetables, he works closely with local organizations and farmers to provide training, tours, and community development opportunities. Rafael became interested in food access and affordability after working with youth in Washington Heights and his own experience growing up in the South Bronx. Dr. Cristina Fernandez, next. Oh, gosh, you guys switched from, sorry.
Change it up.
Okay, Dr. Cristina Fernandez researches the impact of food insecurity and other economic hardships on children's health and serves as a general pediatrician at the Washington Heights Family Health Center. She's the primary care research fellow in the Department of Pediatrics at Columbia University Medical Center and an alum of Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Fernandez also volunteers with multiple local food advocacy initiatives. Anthony Giancaterino, you are in your seat there, directs policy and strategy for the Center for Social Inclusion. Anthony works with food justice leaders and grassroots groups to generate policy strategies and solutions for a more equitable food system from seed to community.
He also works with national policy advocates to create racial equity both in the food and climate movements. And next to Anthony is Diana Robinson. She is the campaign and education coordinator of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. She previously helped represent more than 23,000 grocery store workers in New York in her roles at United Food and Commercial Workers Local 1500. Diana is also a member of the Brooklyn Food Coalition Governing Board and serves as a correspondent on Spanish language radio. We're so grateful to all of you for bringing us into this conversation and very delighted to have everybody here. Simran.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thanks, everyone. It's so lovely to see you all here, and it's such an honor to be a part of this event. I want to thank Lamar. Yes, I already have a mic. Right, thank you. I want to thank Lamar for inviting me. Now I'm realizing how loud my microphone is, to this event. And initially when I said, so who's going to be there? He said, Michelle Obama. How quickly can I get on a plane? But I don't say this lightly. You all are the next best thing to FLOTUS. So thank you. Thank you for taking time. Thank you for being here today. I love that Suzanne already introduced you, so I am not going to go back through that. But I want to jump right in to the conversation that we're going to have. I just briefly would like to frame it. We're going to open it up to questions toward the end of the conversation, but we're going to do an open Q&A before that. Just a little bit of background on why I'm sitting here with these incredible people is because of that book that Suzanne referenced. Food, I think you all know, is who we are. And what we're being told right now in 2016 is that the measures that have been taken, ranging from crushingly low wages and poor treatment of workers to inhumane treatment of animals and the hyper-processing of food and monodiets of monocrops, are the only way that we can now feed ourselves and be fed. And it's why globally foods have become more alike and less diverse. As a matter of fact, the amount of food that is grown and that is eaten around the world has shrunk to just a handful of crops. Regionally and locally, some crops have disappeared or become scarce, while wheat, rice, corn, plus palm oil and soybeans are what we all eat now, in the same types and the same amounts. The increase in carbohydrates, fats, and proteins has helped feed hungry people, of course, but on a global scale, it's also increased our chances of becoming what author Raj Patel calls both stuffed and starved. The world overconsumes energy-dense foods, but eats fewer foods rich in micronutrients, as Christina will be able to tell us more about. Micronutrients are the small but essential amounts of vitamins and minerals that we need for healthy metabolism, growth, and physical development. So we face a paradox. While 795 million people go hungry, over 2 billion people are now overweight, or obese, and both groups are suffering from micronutrient malnutrition. It's impossible, of course, to escape the headlines and the news reports that express concern about food security, a legitimate concern for our growing population. But what I care about is feeding myself and the 805 million people who are hungry today. This includes more than 1 in 5 children in the United States who are food insecure, and a statistic that becomes more heartbreaking when we break it down by race and ethnicity. Almost 40% of African American children and 30% of Latino American children are undernourished. Yet for the past 20 years, the rate of global food production has increased faster than the rate of global population growth. And the world now produces 1.5 times enough food to feed everyone on the planet, which is also enough to feed the population of 9.6 billion that we anticipate by 2050. The reason I share this with you and I want to set this context is this matters because a lot of the changes that we have seen in food and agriculture in our lifetimes have been made in the name of feeding hungry people. The idea of good food has been reduced to foods that grow abundantly and stand strong in the field and that can sustain long journeys and continue to stand strong on supermarket shelves. And while these qualities are important, they're giving short shrift to the many reasons that we choose one food over another, regardless of our budgets. They're also what inform the steady refrain from various players in the food industry that the reason we should settle for inexpensive, marginally nutritious food is because we can't afford anything better. Some of the nonprofits and government officials and businesses who maintain these views mean well because hunger is real and people need to eat. But others, especially those who are profiting from cheap food, are using poverty as an excuse to keep us feeding food of lower quality, sowing fields full of nutrient-poor monocultures, and glutting shelves full of processed foods. And that, to me, is one of the biggest challenges that we'll grapple with on this panel. It's not simply an issue of availability. It's one of access. Food and the resources that are required to buy food aren't efficiently or equally distributed. And some of the hungriest people in the world, ironically, are smallholder farmers. The very same people who are responsible for feeding the majority of the world's population are too poor to buy food. The nonprofit La Via Campesina has been credited, the NGO, I should say, with coining the term food sovereignty, and that's where I want to start our conversation this evening. This is a term that Dina Hoff, who's the North American coordinator for the organization, described as a system of agriculture where people get to decide their own food and agricultural policies in their own countries without being dictated by foundations or institutions like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or trade agreements. People decide what they're going to eat, who's going to produce it, and what's going to be produced. More than that, it's a whole life system that is sustainable, that respects Mother Earth, and that respects human rights and the rights of people to live in dignity, to be well-fed, to be reasonably taken care of, and to have a decent standard of living. Everything that food sovereignty encompasses is human rights, women's rights, and education. Everything that makes a good life and protects the planet. So what I'd like to do is go right down the row right now and ask each of you what food sovereignty means to you and how your work supports and promotes it. So we'll start with you, Christina.
Okay. Well, when I think about food sovereignty, I definitely start with community and empowerment, because of what I'm seeing is a lot of my patients come to me and they talk about wanting to eat a certain type of way and not feeling like they're empowered to because of circumstances in terms of what's available in their communities, what can be afforded, what they can afford in terms of quality foods that they recognize and they know are good for them. But if for a variety of reasons, whether it's monetary or geographic or cultural reasons, there can be a lot of challenge in acquiring that food. So food sovereignty, empowering the community, empowering my patients and families to be able to identify and access the foods that they know are good and nutritious and healthy, and acquire that for their family on a consistent and regular basis.
Thank you. Raphael.
I guess I'm coming at this from the production side of things. I'm the farmer here, not the only one, thank goodness. But food sovereignty, I think it's important to set it against the spectrum. So we talk about food sovereignty, and this is a relatively new term, at least domestically. Like, we don't talk about food sovereignty in the U.S. as much. But to understand that versus the way that we normally talk about it, which is food security. So how many people here just ate a sandwich? Just show of hands, please. Congratulations, you are no longer food insecure. You have food, you secured food. And this is the problem with looking at food security. It's a very tiny snapshot. Whether you have food or you don't, it doesn't say anything about the nutritional value of it. It doesn't say whether that food was raised ethically. It doesn't say anything about whether a person who picked that food and harvested it, if they were paid a living wage. And it doesn't say anything about the power systems or the structures that made that food get to your plate. So that's what food sovereignty is. From the production side of things, I do my very best to make sure that the community lets me know what I need to grow for them because they want to eat it. I feel like there's a kale revolution, right? Some people have described it as we might have even hit peak kale, right? We're over that curve. And kale is great. Kale is very nutritionally dense. It's a great green. You can have it most of the times during the year. But me coming from an Afro-Caribbean background, I never had kale on my plate. But there were plenty of other greens, and we ate them most nights for meals. But it was never in my cultural heritage. So trying to force a nutrition, agenda or whatever on folks who are not used to eating the cultural foods which they came from before industrial agriculture and food production, That's the meaning of food sovereignty. We have to get back to that and let people decide what they want to put on their plate. Because not that long ago, we were eating pretty good.
Great. So I don't know if I have much to add to the first three definitions. But I will say from a policy standpoint around food sovereignty, I think we can make a lot of individual decisions and choices, and we can support CSAs, which are really critical, and we need to do that. But just as what was alluded to, there's a lot of systems and structures that actually create the challenges to actually accessing and determining how we can participate in that situation. And so I think for me, part of the food sovereignty element is how do we actually think about the policy shifts that need to happen so that we actually rethink how we actually invest in our food systems. How are we providing subsidies or not? How are we actually investing in local agricultural communities within an urban context as well as a rural context? Like, what are the policy mechanisms, the financing mechanisms that need to be in place to actually allow for farmers or for communities or for residents to actually have a self-determining right to have culturally appropriate foods, to actually access foods when they need it, the types of foods that they want to have, they provide deep nutritional value at a very accessible way that actually allows them to live. No one should have to choose between feeding their families or paying their energy bill or paying for their rent. And so I think if we achieve food sovereignty, those choices no longer become choices. They're just the rights that you actually have: food, energy, and shelter.
Great. Just listening to everyone in my head, I'm like, yes, yes, yes. It makes me so excited to be on this panel with such great people. And adding to that, yes to culturally appropriate foods, to access to healthy foods, affordable foods, but also addressing something that's really important is access to land, and addressing our historical history of enslaving people to work on the land. And that's really important when we're talking about our food system and how we repair it. It's really addressing the institutional racism that exists within our food system and just what our food system was built on. So having access to land is really important because a lot of Black and brown communities are denied that right. So how do we ensure, for me, food sovereignty means ensuring that here in the U.S. particularly and around the world, that Black and brown communities have access to land to grow food, to cooperative-owned land, to either grow food or whatever other types of businesses that they would be interested in. I think that's a really important part when we're talking about food sovereignty.
Thank you. And we just managed to cover this incredible continuum of what all these folks represent on this stage and to touch all those points of access, security, and justice. None of those in isolation, I think, encompasses what sovereignty does. And so if I were going to rewrite this title, we would just call it food sovereignty. But that's what we're doing right here on this stage, or on this floor, actually, not a stage at all. So I'd like to go back to Diana, exactly what you're saying, and bring Anthony into this. And y'all just please chime in at any point, interrupt me, throw in if you want to add in your 2 cents to any question that I pose to a single person on the panel. But let's talk a little bit more about those institutional barriers that you were talking about. I'd like to move from kind of this broader infrastructure, kind of meta investigation to getting it more personal as we progress through this conversation. So can you talk a little bit, can you elaborate on what you were just saying around the sort of the structural barriers?
Yeah, so...
And then if you'll hand it over to Anthony after that.
Yeah, so in talking about our food system and how it's formed, we know like slaves were working the land. The majority African slaves and African Americans are still impacted by that today. And just, looking back at the National Labor Board, the decision that was made in the 1930s to exclude farm workers and domestic workers from being protected by labor law to organize and to other rights, organizing meaning like organizing into a union. And so we still see that today. Our TIPI system that affects majority of restaurant workers was also part of that. So slaves weren't paid a wage, and so they would tip people. After slaves were emancipated, then this was a system to just tip people so they wouldn't be paid a wage. So there's so much historical context to see in how our food system functions today. Most food workers earn very low wages, and it's because of that history. And I'll pass it over to Anthony.
And so what you're effectively saying is this system has been engineered. I mean, the cheapness that we see is engineered and is created on the backs of people who are directly involved in the system. And it's the invisible part that we don't see when we see the
Exactly.
end product.
So, we don't see all the hands that are part of creating our food, right? The food we eat each day. We know farm workers in the fields that majority now are Latino. And then also restaurant workers, and then in the middle of that, there's processing workers that work at poultry plants, other meat plants, and then all these workers that are involved in providing us our food, but they remain invisible because of, we don't see them, but also that's kind of on purpose, right? We don't have to think about that because we're not seeing them physically.
Thank you.
And in addition, so from a land ownership piece, we also had from 1920 up until the most recent ag census, which was 2012. The 2012 ag census. We had huge declines in black land loss. The most recent ag census actually had a slight uptick, very, very small. But for the most part, just massive declines. And that actually, there's a lot of reasons for that, but two of the most critical reasons were the lack of access to credit. So you actually had very blatant racism, so not even hidden structural racism, actually just very explicitly racist practices within the USDA and the Farm Bureau and accessing credit. So you had a lot of black farmers who would go to get access to credit to actually get capital for their infrastructure or for to purchase land or for seeds or what have you to actually make the farm work, not get that credit, which is one problem for the lead to land loss. And another one was actually the lack of actually having title to the land. So going all the way back to Reconstruction. So I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about it. And so it goes all the way back to slavery, it goes back to Reconstruction. You actually had free black men and women who were no longer slaves getting access to land and actually technically had ownership over land in some cases, but they never had the title. Or the title was lost. It was lost within the courthouses or in the certain local ag, like district offices. And so if they were to die, usually what happens is it just gets passed down to families. But if there's no title or access to that title, the land would then just be split into like 3 or 4 to 5. So if you had 5 children, the 5 children had to split that land. And then if they were to die, the land would get split again. So another 5 people. So the land, instead of being one kind of big plot of land, would actually be over 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, would be these small parcels, which are no longer viable as an economic driver and engine for sustainability. So a lot of times you would just see folks whose grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents actually own fairly large amounts of land to farm, just selling off whatever land they could because they could get more cash now and then not have access to that land. So you see huge declines. And that was very unique primarily to black landowners, not to any other demographic in the country. So that's another big systemic one that was driven both by financing, investment, practices of our financial system within the USDA, but also just the practices of owning title and keeping paperwork that was not shared.
This is actually kind of a perfect segue to Raphael, but before you go there, and we have 2 microphones. We can keep 2 over here, and y'all can share that one if you want to, but I would love for you to just, if you know this data, how many farmers, can you talk a little bit about farmers of color in the United States and how those numbers have changed? Do you know any of that stuff, generally speaking? I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
Not like off the top of my head.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Not off the top of my head. But there is this great organization, the Land Loss Project, which focuses on black land loss and how black farmers in the U.S. have been losing land and how to recuperate that land. And there's a lot of great information there. And there's this great organization that actually is starting now. It's called the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and addressing these issues about black land ownership and other issues that affect black folks, including as workers, as being able to build self-determining economies and things like that. Website's coming soon. You guys should check it out. It's a great organization that's going to be addressing a lot of these issues.
This is great. And this is, I think this speaks to, it's an issue of race, it's an issue of ethnicity, it's an issue of class, that what we've seen certainly over time, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but if anybody does, throw them out, around the consolidation of farms and of land and large-scale ownership of agribusinesses is part of the challenge that we're facing now. So do you want to chime in?
I don't have direct stats. I actually looked it up prior. But I can tell you that among farmers of color, particularly Asian Pacific Islander and Latino farmers, they actually are more likely to grow non-commodity crops. So they'll actually grow more of the fruits and vegetables that we need, and are less likely to be in line for the subsidies of the typical like cotton, wheat, or cotton, corn, sugar subsidies. So I think that's kind of interesting. So you do actually have farmers of color primarily actually growing the fruits and vegetables, and also not getting paid nearly as much as they need to survive. And the second part is what the ag census does not do, and then hopefully this is actually going to shift thanks to some work from New York urban ag folks, is that urban ag is actually not counted. And so there's a tremendous amount of very localized food production happening primarily by communities of color that doesn't even get tapped in the sense of a census, which means they don't get access to resources and to certain accesses to credit that otherwise normal farmers would. So it's an interesting dynamic and debate that's actually going on right now that I think we need to pay attention to.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think those stories then don't get told. I mean, there's so much that gets swept up in this. It's economic challenges, it's infrastructural challenges, and then we have a shining example in someone like Raphael. You're our token farmer on the panel. so share with us a little bit. There was something that you said that I found intriguing I wanted to find out more about. You said, unlike in the city when you were here in New York, that you've moved upstate. Here in Tompkins County, land is everywhere, but traditional farmers can't stay in business. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, that goes back to the history of modern agriculture, industrial ag, conventional agriculture has been called. There was a big push by the USDA to tell farmers, get big or get out. So we need more food. We need to turn the food that you're producing into a commodity, and the only way we could do that is by standardizing it and pushing all this different machinery and things like that. So you lost the small family farm. And the ones that managed to stay afloat had to fight with now a global market. So it's milk being produced all over the world, and now you have to compete with those milk prices. And if you can't get your price per gallon that you were normally used to getting, because now there's an overproduction, you're gonna lose. You're not gonna be able to sustain your farm. It's a very resource intensive business. And just for Tompkins County, just coming back to the point that we were making. I try to look at these stats. I said, I know for a fact I'm one of two farmers of color for the entire county that are principal landowners, actually owns the farm business that they work on. And I try to look at the rest of the numbers, and you pull up the USDA because they're mandated to take stats and look at these numbers, and error 404 pops up on the page when you look at minorities in terms of farming. But women are still counted, right? So that's one big victory in ag so far. There are a lot more women farmers than there used to be. Unfortunately, they stopped counting after they were able to get that opportunity. And the same thing is, I think it's also important to bring up, none of this land belonged to us in the first place. There's a lot of indigenous communities throughout. I run into it all the time in New York State, who are still denied access to farming and the same resources that other farmers do have. And when I first landed in Tompkins County, they looked at me like I was an alien. They were like, what is this guy doing? Where are you from? What is your accent?
Did you do that?
Yeah, why are you doing this thing?
Yeah. No, but really tell us why.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And when they realized I was a farmer just like them, and I knew what they did, I was able to do the same things they were and produce food. They were like, okay, I guess he's in.
He is one of us.
Yep. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does. I think it also speaks to one of the things that I have this great opportunity to do with all these incredible minds is make, I think, a lot of what's invisible visible. And one of the things that's already popped up is that idea of what's hidden, but on so many structural levels. And if we don't know it, if we don't count it, if we don't understand how prices are distorted, then we can't solve these problems. So when you are saying, look, our dairy farmers are now competing with all these dairy farmers from all over the world, I mean, this is what globalization does, right? This is what trade policies like NAFTA, the TPP that's before us right now has the process to make even more challenging for farmers, I think, in particular farmers of color or any farmers that are kind of, not working on thin margins. And I guess, what I would love to know before we move to Christina is just if any of you have, any resources that you would draw people to start to better understand some of these hidden challenges that aren't really being addressed. Because you hear the price of milk went up and you don't know what that means, or you hear that, all these, we're now getting our corn from, corn's flooding the market from, let's just say Mexico, which I'm making up on the fly, but, and what are these impacts, what are these implications, what does it mean to grow a commodity crop versus a crop that is consumed by people? I think we have these very vague notions of what these things mean, but if you could drill down a little bit and illuminate for us, that would be great.
Sure. I think... So to understand commodity crops, I'm small potatoes in terms of farming, no pun intended. I have a 10-acre farm, and I produce what's called specialty crops. Specialty crops is anything that is not a commodity crop, so things that we weren't able to set a price on and produce in mass. So, corn, soybean, wheat are our main staples, especially in New York State. Dairy is also another big one, and what else are we good at? Apples. We're great at apples. The big apple, come on. But in terms of this, the whole thing is completely invisible. When you look at the policy around, we do not have a food policy in the U.S. What we have is an agricultural policy. It favors the producer, and it makes them grow up to a certain scale. It does not favor the small farm. It's scaling up to this larger industrial scale farm with the medium income that would put the farmer in the middle class. But everyone else is pretty much left out the equation. And we don't have a food policy. It doesn't benefit the consumers. It doesn't benefit the eaters of all this food. We don't even have a say where that food goes. It mostly goes to export, right, for U.S. foreign aid, which seems strange, right? And we have an overproduction problem here in the U.S. I think you were saying a little bit about, the global numbers and how much hungry people we have in the world. But we also, most of our food, 1/3 of it goes to waste automatically off the bat.
1/4 of it in the United States, 1/3 of it globally.
Yep. Yeah. So we have an overproduction problem. That doesn't tell me that we have a food policy. We have to pull this thing out piece by piece. So wherever you stand, if you're looking at this from a health standpoint, start to look at what the health effects are in the food system. Where does that apply? If you're looking at this from an education standpoint, a labor standpoint, it's going to take all this interdisciplinary action to really get a whole picture of what this thing is.
You mentioned health, and I'd love to bring Christina into the conversation to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing here, and we'll, of course, circle back in a minute. But talk to us a little bit about what has surprised you in your work. I think everyone now has an understanding of the role, the public health crisis we're experiencing because of the way we eat. But has there been anything in your work in particular that has really, been surprising to you that people in the public domain didn't know or that you yourself didn't know before you got started?
I think that it's important for us to separate the idea of food insecurity and hunger for just a moment, because there's food insecurity with hunger and there's food insecurity without hunger. And I think that it's very surprising, and I myself have been surprised by the faces of food insecurity, both with and without hunger. There's a hidden nature to it. People on the street, classmates who could and do suffer from food insecurity with and without hunger. And that has been one of the biggest surprises for me, especially thinking about a lot that's been coming out with regard to food insecurity on college campuses, among college students, among graduate students.
Will you clarify the definition? Food insecurity is the continued access, right? Would you elaborate, please, between those differences for everybody?
Sure. When we talk about food insecurity, we're talking about the inability to maintain a consistent access to food. And we also have to kind of break it down a little bit more in terms of the quality of the food that there is an inconsistent access to. So if you have food insecurity, it's an inability to meet the household need for food on a consistent basis. But you can have food. Potentially that means a family of 4 with young children is having plain pasta, maybe mixed with butter, every day for dinner for 3 weeks. They're eating, but
they're not food insecure, but they're not well fed.
And that's where the nuances go, because they have food, so technically they're not food insecure. But just because they're not hungry at that particular time doesn't mean that there's not a problem. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that we face is really getting a sense of not only what are some of the challenges by the communities who are having food insecurity with hunger, and the challenges for the communities that are having food insecurity without hunger, but then what do we do about that? Do we focus on just providing food, which is where a lot of us may have had a chance to volunteer at food pantries or soup kitchens, and we're seeing, or our religious institutions, our community centers are collecting food and distributing food to people in need. And then let's take a step back and look at the types of food that are then being distributed. We have wonderful organizations that are absolutely donating fruits and vegetables, and our farmers in state who are supplying food that's being used by organizations such as the Food Bank for New York City, such as City Harvest, to then distribute to community partners around the city. And then we have donations that are made for shelf-stable food that's going to last, that a lot of families say, well, I need this food to last, especially if they may be receiving some type of government benefit or transfer and are really trying to piece together where their food is coming from. So shelf-stable food, canned food, processed food, dried food, dehydrated food. I mean, it's a very tricky situation. We want our neighbors to be eating, and is any food better than no food? And that's where I feel like as a pediatrician, it really is a constant challenge for me, because I want my families who are hungry to be eating, and yet if they're not eating things that they know are nutritious and I know are nutritious, where do we go from there? And that's where I feel like some of the conversation that I've been privy to and that I continue to learn about has been so eye-opening for me and so surprising.
Thank you. Diana, one of the things that has surprised me most, I'm really glad you brought up this idea of, like, just because we have food doesn't mean that we're gonna feel like we have access to it, like the kale, or that it's gonna be healthy or nourishing food for us. And appropriate and access, I think, are words that are so laden. But one of the things that also has surprised me is the irony I described earlier around farmers, smallholder farmers in the world being some of the hungriest people in the world. The same applies to people who are involved in the food industry. Would you share a little bit of those insights?
Yeah, so just here in the U.S., there's 20 million people who work in our food system, all the way from farms to the restaurants where you eat and everything in between, from distribution to processing, and even retail grocery store workers. And so in talking about food insecurity, food workers actually suffer from food insecurity at a higher rate than other workers in other sectors. And so it's a cruel irony, right? So the people who are growing your food, serving you your food, processing your food, can't afford to feed themselves and their families. And that has a lot to do with wages that food workers earn. Like I mentioned earlier, food workers earn very low wages. And also, because they earn those low wages, they're also in neighborhoods which are underserved. So it's kind of this vicious cycle, right? There's no access to healthy, affordable food, low-wage jobs, so it kind of is cyclical, right? We see how this comes full circle. So, and something Christina was saying that really resonated with me is, in dealing with, like, this paradox, right? We want people to be fed, to eat, but what kind of foods are they eating? So for me, that's really we need to address a system. It has to be systemic change, because we can have food banks, we could provide people with food, but we're really not addressing the root causes or the root issues, which it's poverty. And so to really make the change we want to see, we need to address these root causes. And so hiring people's wages, having ability for people to have job training so that they can move up within their workplaces. So I think these are solutions to addressing this system. Absolutely.
I think the question for a lot of people has been like, this is all we can afford, this is all we can have. And it's like, well, why is this all we can afford? What is in place that keeps us from being able to earn more, to feed ourselves better? And I do want to kind of delve into this a little bit more, because that pulls up the question. We need to pay farmers more. We need to pay everyone involved in food production more. We need to be paying the real cost of food, which is completely distorted through subsidies and tariffs and what have you. But at the same time, we need to make sure it's accessible to everybody financially as well as culturally. So how do we reconcile this? And very shortly, Anthony, I want to bring in your 3 steps to jumpstarting a community-grounded economy around this. But Christina, do you have anything? What do you do with this? How do we say, like, yeah, let's pay everybody more, and then how do we all afford it? You know, I mean, what do we do with that?
That's a big question.
Yeah, I just laid it right in your lap, too. Sorry.
But I think it's in partnerships, right? We're talking about how do we all work together to really make this all happen. So one of the things that my organization has been involved in is in the HEAL Food Alliance, which stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor, and all these different sectors coming together to kind of address, like, creating a food policy for the U.S. for the next president to address these issues that exist. So how do we come together to create these solutions? And there are partnerships with farmers and food workers, farmers with farm workers, because a lot of times they're antagonized, right? They're not natural allies because, you know, farmers, I can't pay more because then I can't pay my workers more. There's this... it created this kind of, distance between farmer and farm worker, but now there's a lot of talks between farmers and farm workers, and here in New York State, you know, there is a push for a $15 minimum wage, and NOFA actually came out in support that they support, which is a group of farmers here in New York State, and they support a $15 minimum wage, but also, you know, they also want to support farmers. Like, how do we support farmers as well? So I think we can create these solutions, but we have to work together.
Thank you. Anthony, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, so it is a big question. And I think a part of it actually, this is actually the really intersectional pieces. So it's for a lot of reasons, and we all do this, we silo ourselves in particular issue areas, and that's, I think it's more of a subset because it just makes it manageable for us to figure out how to navigate the complexity of our world. But we miss a lot of opportunities. And so this actually, it goes to tax policy. I mean, thinking about how do we set up taxes, and how do we actually invest in infrastructure? How do we invest in communities, in our schools? Who gets taxed to actually carry the weight and not? I think is a big question. Because there's enough money to go around in this country that no one should have to worry about how much they're paying for food, that everyone should be fairly. It's just a matter of how do we distribute that in a more fair way. So I think that's a really critical piece. And then on this working together, you know, there's an untold story back in the late 1800s around the populist movement. And we're seeing it now in this election. There's like populism keeps getting thrown around a lot from both sides of the parties. But, you know, there was a big push to actually organize urban workers in the north and southern farmers in the south through a huge populist movement that actually would unite very distinctly different communities, which we still face today. We still face these divides of urban, rural, still a huge challenge in energy and food and social issues. And they actually tried to unite that, and the number one reason why that did not take off was of race. And they realized that, hey, wait a minute, if we unite white rural farmers with urban workers, as well as people of color, who loses out? It's going to be us, the landowners. We don't want that. So they actually started using race as a wedge to actually divide urban and rural back in the 1800s as part of the populist movement. So I think it's a lesson we have failed to heed or even look to in our history, to think about how do we actually start bridging these gaps to actually create holistic transformation.
So what you're saying is we need to pull back once again and really look at this in a much broader way to solve food problems. We're talking about social equity. We're talking about racial justice. We're just, you know, right kind of at the beginning of all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, that's
Well, I just, I want to just, because I love this, you know, your 3 steps to jumpstarting a community-grounded economy.
I remember writing this. I don't remember
Okay,
the
well,
exact
I'm going to
steps.
refresh your memory because it was center on, you know, and I'm going to say race/ethnicity/gender/class, class in analysis and understanding. Prioritize community members as experts and leaders. To that point, any lay person who's involved in this, whether, you know, who has skin in the game, whether it's a farm worker or a food processor, like that, they are experts within this as well. And then I would say, and then you talk about crafting transformative policies. And I just wonder, in the scheme of what we're talking about today around food sovereignty, how those things kind of come into play.
Yes, I think maybe I'll talk in the middle one. So I feel like the transformative policies we can get into, it kind of gets to the stepping back, though I think helps us see that. But looking at people as experts and as innovators and producers is really critical, and we never do that. Like, it's always like, oh, it's consumer. So it's either always consumers, or we're always looking at, especially in communities of color.
People in this room, or it's like the fancy people in this room.
Right. It's like who, a lot of times communities of color always look at deficits. So every time we hear about SNAP, you hear about food stamps, it's always like, oh, those people of color. Or all those poor people, they need assistance. Like, it's always passed down, and it's just like, well, actually, why do they need assistance? Well, it's because of all these other systemic problems. So, but instead of taking time to think about, okay, actually, how are they a part of our economy? Like, how are we positioning those communities to be actually drivers of our economy is a really critical piece. And even this whole, CSI, I'll own this as a CSI. Like, CSI creates sometimes some of these challenges and problems of being a capacity builder or a technical assistant organization with food community groups. And so we'll get funding from foundations to do that. Maybe it's like, well, actually, maybe the foundations need to be working with some of these grassroots communities to see them as what expertise and technical value and ideas that they have in building the food system, and then maybe they can engage with CSI for some of the things they don't have, instead of it being like the foundation decides this is what you should work on, CSI you can fill that role, and then you go work with the community. We try to fight that. It's not easy because we also, need a paycheck too. So there's like a balance, to be honest about it, but it is something that we, I think, all have to really think about. How do we actually value and center the expertise of communities first and foremost, and it's easy for us to forget.
And how do we recognize our own power?
Yeah.
I think that, if everybody in this room, how can each of us recognize the way that we can start supporting and moving toward food sovereignty? How do you do this with your patients? How do you empower people who are coming in who aren't well to try to heal themselves?
So a lot of it is really giving them time, which, as many of you probably are aware, is so lacking in terms of patient-provider communication and interactions, but really trying to give them, even if it's just a few minutes, to voice their concern, to voice their frustration, and then figuring out, well, what role can I play in moving this conversation forward for them. It can be as simple as doing a food insecurity screen, and actually there's a validated 2-question checklist that I can kind of check off the boxes, but really just getting a sense from them what's happening, what's been happening over the past month, what's been happening over the past year, and do they need resources? Is there any information I can provide at this time? Is there any referral I can make? How can I hook them up so that they don't feel like, okay, well, I just said this, and now I'm going to kind of disappear into this or fall through the gap, and you're gonna move on to your next patient, or think everybody's going to forget about the situation, and I'm going to be lost in the system, because the system can be very confusing. So with the little bit of time that and the more time I wish I had, with the little bit of time I have, I'm really trying to educate myself in terms of what I as a healthcare provider can do in informing and empowering my patients to take the steps that they already want to take, but just may not know where to take that initiative or where to take that information. A lot of them recognize what the issues are already. It's not about me necessarily preaching. It's really about how can I open a door or make a call or make a referral, and just really try to connect families who have a need, who know they have a need, who want some support to the people that can give them that information or that next step.
Thank you. I can't believe we only have 5 minutes left, and we're going to open up for questions. So, Raphael, I'm going to ask a question, and if you would wrap it into your final comments, and then we'll get final comments from everyone. But to that point of empowerment, to that notion, that Wendell Berry shared about eating being an agricultural act, I wonder if you could just share a little bit about how you think we can start to reconnect to our, not food system, not this kind of abstract thing, but to our food. And you could, use your own journey as an example, but what steps do you think people can take to feel more connected to what you do?
I think the first one is it's understanding your own history, understanding that we had our own foods. Everyone here has their own foods that they grew up, and that's part of their cultural and ethnic identity, and just honoring that. I believe that it's more than our legacy. When we talk about American foods, we're not hot dogs and chicken nuggets. Right. This is beyond our cultural legacy. We got to start to look beyond that when things were unadulterated for some period of time, and reclaim those things. Let's begin to cook again. Let's begin to grow again. How many people have grown food or grown something, produced something, and eaten it before? Whatever it might be. That's a lot of good hands. That's a lot of hands. I like that. So here we go. This is it. This is the revolution in action. It starts there, and then you can scale up if you want to. Talk to me later.
Good. In moments. In moments, we're going to pose that question. Thank you. Thank you. I love that you use the word revolution, because I really do think eating is a revolutionary act, and we're making so many decisions. And I want to wrap up with final comments. I'd mentioned this to all of you before we started, but that question of like, how do we feed one another? How do we feed each other well? And I mean feed broadly. How are we nourished? And you can take this wherever you want to go with it, but one of the questions that you all posed is what gives you hope? And I'd love to kind of end this with just something that says to everybody who's walking out this door what decisions we make moving forward are meaningful, because I think this is the one area where we're doing it a couple times a day, we hope, eating, we're making these decisions, and we really do have agency around them if we're sitting in this room. So with that, Diana, do you want to start?
So I think for me, like how we can feed each other, or it's just really like holding each other, right? Like ensuring that those marginalized communities, whether it's workers, people of color, are part of these conversations and how we are creating change, and that solutions are not presented to them, that they can craft solutions, that they have ideas, and that should be honored. And I think that's really important, because it's a mistake that continues to happen over and over again, where solutions are given to a community and they have no input. And that, again, we're kind of recreating these systems of oppression, and that's not what we want to do. And what's feeding me, really, it's like the Black Lives Matters movement, connecting that to food justice and how that's important. That really, to say like a common saying that people say now, that gives me life. So I'm really excited to see what can come out of that and how we can all work together to support each other. And I think that's what we need to do, like support each other, share stories, and really elevate what's going on and just spread the word.
So I was thinking about this question for a while. So I think, I'll start. What gives me hope is I have a 2.5-year-old daughter, and so that itself gives me hope. But she loves to be in the kitchen, and so the kitchen for my family growing up, and then I'm definitely transferring this to her, is kind of like the space where everything happens, is in the kitchen. And so even yesterday, my wife had to work. And so we prepared dinner together, and she's like putting the rice, and she's like, I love rice. And then she's like, ooh, cauliflower, that's my favorite. And then she's like, oh, broccoli, that's my favorite. So we're like cooking together. It's a 2.5-year-old. I mean, she was doing little things, but it was fun because I just wanted her to get in the habit of like understanding food and participating in that. So there's that piece of giving me hope and just like transferring this idea of like cooking together. And we have a little garden in the back, so in springtime we can grow the food together. But also, it's not lost on me, I'm the white dude on the panel. As Diana just mentioned, Black Lives Matter has actually has done a phenomenal and tremendous job at shifting the conversation of race in this country, and put it at the same time as we have a lot of some really horrible things coming out during this election. But as a white person entering the space, like how do I hold myself accountable, and to communities, and particularly marginalized communities, and how do I also share in that conversation with my daughter as she grows up, so that she identifies what we do in the kitchen as also part of this revolutionary moment. I haven't figured it out yet, but learning and growing in that space, I think, is what kind of is the way I can help feed each other and have hope.
Thank you.
I would say how we can make this thing happen is don't let the invisible stay invisible, right? If there's stuff that we see, it's part of the social fabric that we all live in. We're not aware of how many times we blink our eyes, but we all just did it in the past 10 seconds, right? And the way that we participate in our food system, and the way that we participate in these social dynamics, our race, our own gender identities. You walk into a restaurant and you notice that all the wait staff and all the people in the kitchen are black and brown people, but there's only white people at patroning it. Or a farmer's market that seems really successful and awesome, and then who's not at the table? Is it accessible to seniors? Is it accessible for people with mobility issues? We got to start to look at what is invisible and draw attention to it. Anthony didn't have to say he was the only white dude on the panel, but he is, and we see it, right? So this is how we have a conversation and we bring it to light. There's a place for everyone.
I really appreciate that over the last few years I've been invited to and able to participate in these conversations more and more, and that there's a recognition of the fact that this issue is bigger than each one of our particular areas. And I think Anthony put it best. It's very easy to get so siloed in our particular respective specialties, but to recognize and being able to participate in opportunities where there are conferences or conversations or markets or teachbacks or what have you, whether it's the students in school or school gardens or visiting the farms or the block party with where there's a table with somebody who wants to do a cooking demonstration from the food that they use in the garden down the block. I mean, whatever it is, just having people coming together and talking, but then also listening to each other is super exciting and gives me a lot of hope. And certainly as somebody who works with young people, seeing them start to get excited and interested and wanting to participate in this conversation is also incredibly motivating. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you. And there's room for everybody in this conversation. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. We're going to take 3 questions, and then the panel will choose which one they're going to answer, and then we'll do that one more time, and then we'll call it a night. So do I hand these microphones, or are there microphones? Or you could just shout it out, I see a hand right here, and...
They need it
for the recording?
Yep.
Do you want these ones? Yeah? You'll be question 2. You're welcome. There's that woman right over there who's going to take the first question.
Ready for it?
I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Ashley, and I'm from the Mailman School of Public Health. Sorry, I wrote my question down. It's how do you continue to stress, engage, and educate people and communities around the importance of food and what we put in our bodies when there are so many other daily obstacles and stressors that these communities are facing and need to overcome?
That's a great question. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So I'm Daria. I'm from the Nutrition Institute. And my question is, so recently, I think maybe just a few days ago, France mandated for large grocery stores to have to, I think, donate some of their food waste. And I was wondering how you think that could help to reduce food insecurity in the U.S.
Thank you. And I'll take that microphone back from you. And we have one more question. Terrific. Do you mind passing this microphone back? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm also from the Mailman School of Public Health. My question is also sort of related to food waste and sort of this tension that I've been seeing between food equity and these creative solutions to reducing food waste and to increasing food access to communities. So, we're seeing like the imperfect fruit campaigns, the ugly fruit, and reclaiming food and bringing it to communities that need it. But where does I see a tension between this sort of second-tier food and the communities that need it the most. So kind of how do we rectify that?
Great
question.
I need a microphone back, and anyone on the panel is free to synthesize or answer these questions. Who wants to take that? Don't all do it at once. Okay.
And I guess I'll combine a couple of questions. So when it comes to providing, is food the issue, right? People face so many other different issues in their daily life. How do you make them care about food and the food waste question? And I think it goes back to agency. So people don't have control over these systems in their lives, and they feel powerless. And food is one of the places where they can feel that power again. When you cook a meal for your friends and your family, you know what food is doing. When you eat a good meal, and you rub your stomach, you're like, oh yes, I'm feeling good. But to the waste question, it's about the same thing about agency. So did these communities ask for secondhand produce? And a lot of the times the answer is no. So there's a dignity issue there. So if you don't overcome and challenge that and say, well, how do we provide this produce to people in a dignified way, then it's not going to be received in the same way. It's going to be more of this charity model and not giving power back to the communities. that want the food in the first place.
Diana has something. Do you want to add something, Diana? Yeah.
No, I was just like,
Just
yes.
agreeing?
It was
Okay,
good.
perfect. Let's go to our next round of questions. Great. There's a microphone right over there. I think we'll keep this one down here, this mic. That probably makes more sense. Unless, oh, well, there's two over there. Let's do this again. Sorry, I stepped on your foot.
So, hi. I just wanted to mention, I think there's one... Sorry. My name is Guillem. I'm from the College of Dental Medicine. I think there's been one topic that hasn't been brought up, which is the global policies that are necessary. For example, there is the issue about accounting for the CO2 footprint in the prices of products, and this would immediately help the farmers here, as well as it would reduce the monocultures and enrich the food that is available to everybody very easily, because we would increase the local demand. And I'm wondering basically whether the farmers in the US are actually policing, lobbying for that, or that's not a priority for them right now.
And we'll take two more questions. Thank you. These have been great questions. Thank you so much, you guys.
Hi there, my name is Tiffany, and I'm from the program in nutrition at Teachers College down at the Morningside campus. So my question is, you guys mentioned a lot of really great solutions like fair wages for restaurant workers, tax policy that you're redistributing the balance of wealth in the United States and things of that nature. I'm curious as to how you see getting the whole United States on board to vote policies like this into place, because I believe in them. But we're obviously in a place where you can tell in the United States that's a very big challenge. So how can we get the word out? How can we get people on board so that everyone in this room can do their part for that?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carolyn, and I'm a first-year medical student. And I am wondering, for those of us who are eager and hungry to help create change, this may be a really challenging question, but what is one thing that we can do that will be the most helpful? I'm wondering, is it lobbying for the next farm bill? What can we do, and what is most vital?
I hope all of you will answer this. Let's start down there.
So the question around how do we get policies like this passed and support for them, I think with a lot of, we've seen whether it's like increasing the minimum wage or things around food, labeling food and things like that, it's really moving locally, right? So I think that's one way to look at it. One of the things that we've been working on, it's a good food purchasing program that addresses 5 different areas, 5 value areas, which focuses on local food purchasing, on sustainable creation of food, animal welfare, a valued workforce, and nutrition. And it's a really comprehensive policy that kind of looks at all these different things for institutional food procurement and how we create standards in how food is procured. So we're really excited about that and looking into introducing something like that in New York. And there's different campaigns around the country around that. So I think that's one way to look at it. There's also the Plate of the Union is this campaign that's kind of addressing that. How do we create a food policy agenda for the next president? So it's like a play on the State of the Union, Plate of the Union. It's cool. So that's something you can look into. And I think for us to pass these policies, we need to build, like we're saying, empowering people and creating this people power and ensuring that we hold our government accountable for things that we want to see change. Thank you. And I don't know if others want to answer the other questions.
So I'll just add on to that. Yeah, definitely check out the HEAL Alliance. If there's one thing you can do right now, I would check out the HEAL Alliance and the Plate of the Union for sure. But also, I think there's one thing it's going to depend on your area and entry point. So and I can't speak to all those because I just don't have that experience. But I think there's going to be certain things you can do as a medical professional that's going to play a particular role. If you're a policy advocate, there's going to be particular things you can do. So I know that's like kind of a cop-out of an answer, but I think it's true. Like there's like these strategies of circles of how do you move change. That there's like, you need to resist, you need to like reform, you need to transform. And we need people in all 3 areas. So some people who are really good at like fighting against bad or trying to like take on, Monsanto and GMOs or take on ConAgra and the consolidation. Like people should keep on working on that. You just have to be aligned with the people who are trying to do good food procurement reform. and then people who are like trying to do what they're doing in the Bronx with Karen Washington and Ray Figueroa, like a micro food hub. So like, which is a totally transformative, way different way of thinking about food agriculture. Like we need everyone to play particular roles and pieces. So that's going to have to be, depending on what your entry point is, how you play into that. And then the other piece, just on like, how do you build this broad agenda of support? There's a framework I really love, and it comes out of the climate justice space/labor space. It's called Just Transition, and this actually can speak a little bit to the CO2, because that actually comes from a broader climate way. And it's trying to link communities and labor, workers and owners, rural and urban, like in this broad conversation of we need to transition our economy, we need to transition away from fossil fuels to what we don't know. Like that's part of the beauty of it, is like we have to build what that vision looks like. But if we are actually building these relationships, urban and rural, community and labor together to actually build something, we actually, I think, can start slowly building the agenda. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. Probably not going to happen in the next 15. But I think we need to start really putting the work in on this kind of broader framework of an analysis and relationship building, and we can start to chip away at that.
I'll be brief. So the gentleman who I believe, I heard it as a sustainability question, right? This climate change and CO2. The short answer is no. The farmers just don't have time to gather around and to have these conversations. It's very rare for a room of farmers to get together. This is the season for it, so if you know some farmers, invite them to go start to talk. But it's very difficult. Everything's production oriented and driven, and you just don't have the time to sit and work on it. So if you do have time to organize some of those things and be those like weavers, those in-between folks, then that's very necessary too. And something that you can do immediately, or might be the best impact to this, is just understanding how this functions. It takes a tremendous amount of skill to actually identify these systems and like how they play out in everybody's individual life. Get stronger at that so you can call it out when you see it.
Thanks. I would say, as somebody who is a physician and working certainly within a very small space in this greater conversation, I've found that there is so much that I need to learn, and by putting myself out there and meeting people and participating in events that put me in touch with people who are doing things that are completely outside of the scope of my training and education, it has been a tremendous experience, and I feel like it has given me a little bit more credence then in being able to go back to my patients, go back to my community, and engage in a better and more worthwhile conversation on this. Certainly some specific things. Interestingly enough, for better or for worse, as a physician, I feel like I've been invited to advocate for things, lending my voice, because there's a sense of, oh, as a doctor, they will listen to you, ... whether it's being interviewed for something or being part of a campaign testifying for something, for better or for worse. So I found that part of this experience is not only educating myself and engaging in conversations like this and meeting people who are doing incredible work in this sphere, but then also using my time and using my voice to support and advance efforts on behalf of these various movements. Because even as somebody who is not necessarily a policy maven or a farmer or somebody who really is knowledgeable on how to organize workers, there is a role that medicine has to play in this, and finding that and running with it has been so exciting, and I really look forward to moving it forward. So there is a space to be able to contribute to the work that these incredible people are doing, and kind of tack on, well, yes, I'm an MD, so you are going to invite all of us to that meeting, because you're inviting me and I'm going to bring everybody else with me, and we're all going to sit down and talk about this together.
Of course you can.
In terms of farmers and farmer groups that are advocating for policies and things that benefit farmers, so I don't know particularly around the CO2 emissions or footprints, but there are two farmer organizations, the National Family Farm Coalition and also the National Family Farm Defenders, which is made up of farmers who come together to talk about these issues. They're actively against the TPP. They did a lot of work against the TPP. So, there are groups nationally that are coming together in coalition with farmers and policy experts and things like that who are trying to address these issues. So maybe you can find some information about that there.
Thank you. Thank you. So the seeds have all been planted, and now we have a little bit of understanding of all the forces that conspire to get food on our plates or not. And so I'm so grateful that you all took the time this evening. Thank you. And this information will be available online, right? You can listen to the playlists. Will there be a link to the video? Share with your friends. And Suzanne's going to tell us more. Take it away, Suzanne.
Great. And before we... Thank you, panelists. I actually want to add just 2 points to the list, 2 suggestions and requests. One is that one of the places that it is very important to continue this conversation is within the university. And I would invite you, we have this Ideas and Action space for digital conversation at universitylife.columbia.edu. If you email us at universitylife@columbia.edu, we can foster further conversation there. The second is that you will all receive a link to the video from this panel fairly shortly, and we'd ask that you share it out on social media. You'll find it on the University Life social media. Share it out with 10 people, right? Foster the conversation, bring it further. I also want to invite you to our next Awakening Our Democracy conversation, which is March 10th on the Morningside campus, and you'll get more information about that in the email. And most of all, I want to thank all of our conversationalists here for a really extraordinary, informative, and inspiring discussion. Thank you very, very much. We're very grateful. And I think it's fair to say that you're all willing to stay around for a few minutes and talk with people who are here. So please feel free to come down and carry on conversation. Thank you again for coming.
I have these great comic books. They're called Food Chain Avengers. They're $3 each. So if you're interested, you can come see me. Thank you.